All right, I know many of you have been waiting for this big interview tonight. So the response we have witnessed in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing in the United States is a reflection of pent-up frustration and persistent racism, and that black lives have not mattered in that country. So that's the view of South Africa's former President Thabo Mbeki in an exclusive conversation with the SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He addressed issues of racism in the United States and here in South Africa, the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, threats of multi-lateralism, and what former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo's return to Cote d'Ivoire could mean for the West African country. He also weighed in on the Swedish investigation into the assassination of his friend and former Prime Minister Olof Palme. Let's take a look.
Former President Thabo Mbeki, we appreciate your time today. Thank you for speaking with us.
No, thanks for having us.
Mr. President, the issue of structural racism has been placed front and center after the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police, leading to expressions of protest we have witnessed on the streets of the United States and around the world. Given your long-standing engagement and leadership on issues of race and racism, I wonder how this moment has struck you, sir.
Well, I think that, of course, we, for many years, we've kept an eye on this particular issue of racism as it occurs in the US. Naturally, because of the racism that we faced here, and as an old link, as you know, between ourselves here and the African-American community. So we kept an eye on this thing, and it's been quite clear for a very long time that there's very deeply entrenched racism in the United States. Despite all of the progress that's happened over the years with all sorts of legislation passed to do away with racism, but it's clear that it's very deeply entrenched. One of the areas that's been an area of focus, of course, is the criminal justice system, of which policing is a part. Mm-hmm. So the issues that arose after the murder of George Floyd, about, in fact, the very slogan, Black Lives Matter, arose in the first instance because of the same issue, of the way the police were responding to the black population. And so I think the response that we are seeing after the murder of George Floyd is really a response to a very pent-up feeling, a deeply pent-up feeling, because of the persistence of this issue, that in terms of the racism that is persisted in the United States, Black lives have not mattered. And the murder of Floyd, people like Errol Garner in the past and so on, have been a reflection of that fact that Black lives don't matter. So I think that what we've seen now, the struggle, the demonstrations right throughout the country, which have persisted now for a whole 2 weeks, I think are a reflection of how frustrated the people are. And surely I think the message must be that there is a very serious and urgent need in the US to address this matter of the criminal justice system. You got a disproportionate number of prisoners in the US prisons who are African American. You get all these people who are getting killed by the police who are African American. So I'm saying the entirety of the criminal justice system is a reflection of this persisting racism in the United States. And I think out of this current struggle, surely must come a radical reform of that criminal justice system.
I will talk about the reaction that we've seen on the streets, Mr. President, in a moment, but I want to take a step back at this juncture. I wondered earlier, and so I will do so aloud with you right now, how on a more personal note, seeing that video of a white man with his knee on a handcuffed black man's neck as the life was drained from him hit you on a personal level, given your personal losses that you've endured at the hands of apartheid's white men?
Well, I mean, it just reflected what for us, I'm saying for us as South Africans, as Black South Africans, it was a recall back to the apartheid years, because that kind of behavior of white police officers against Black people in South Africa was normal, was standard. It was a reflection of this very deep-seated white superiority notion that Black lives don't matter.
Right.
That in fact these Black people are subhuman. You could treat them anyhow. When I saw that video of that police officer with his knee on Floyd's neck, it immediately recalled that here we've got an expression of the same kind of problem, the same kind of challenge, which resulted in our case of so many people getting killed by white police officers because the attitude was, these people are subhuman. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what drove the kind of action that we saw now in Minneapolis, which resulted in the death of George Floyd.
So let's talk then about the reaction we've seen, right? You spoke recently, Mr. President, at the launch of the Africa and African Diaspora Conference, a follow-up to the 1945 Pan-African Conference that brought attention to issues of decolonization of Africa and the West Indies. You quoted W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and America and the islands of the sea. That's the direct quote. You believe those words 117 years later still hold true today, only that it now applies to the 21st century. Where are we going wrong?
Well, you see, it's the challenge of the transformation of global society. We have said in the past that even this process of globalization, in many instances, it looked to be a globalization of the system of apartheid, a globalization of this discriminatory political, economic, and so on international order. And therefore, the problem of the color line, you are talking about 1903 by W.E.B. They raised that issue earlier in 1900. That's at the first Pan-African Conference in London, where they said the problem of the color line is a problem of the 20th century. So I'm saying that's persistent because the global society has not changed and been transformed in a manner such that the color line ceases to be the problem. It's persistent in the same way, I suppose, I'm quite certain, that we've seen racism persist in the United States. The same way that you see racism persist in South Africa.
Right.
So I think that observation, that the problem of the 20th century, problem of the color line, it remains a problem of the 21st century.
So I'm glad you made that comparison, Mr. President, because it leads to my next question. So we've heard people talk about George Floyd's death and perhaps how capturing his experience on video was a wake-up call for many who have sat on the sidelines of issues of race and racism, particularly white people who have turned out in their numbers, often dominating protests here by using their majority over the last 2 weeks. How does that strike you in the South African context that you are more familiar with?
No, I thought this was a very good thing that you are having so many of white America participating in the struggle, in this protest movement after the murder of George Floyd. Because it seemed to me that what is happening in the US is the birth of what one would call a national movement against racism. A national movement against racism, particularly as it relates to the African Americans. So black and white coming together saying this is a common national challenge. Mm-hmm. It's not a challenge only to the African American population. It's a challenge to the entirety of the US population. I think that's a very, very good thing. And I think it's that unity across the racial divide in the United States, I think, which gives a hope that we will not just end up with having had magnificent demonstrations,
Right.
but we'll end up with the society changing practically in a very, very significant way to address the complaint, so that indeed, I'm saying, in the first instance, the criminal justice system needs to be changed so that Black lives must matter. That would regard with regard to policing, that would regard to the way that the courts have dealt with the matter, the prisons, everything. And I think that the possibility to effect that kind of change arises from the fact that you are getting a united national movement in the States, bringing together black and white. I'm saying this is a common national challenge.
So let's bring it home to South Africa. So the United States, Mr. President, is a much older democracy, right, than South Africa is, and yet remains, as we have been discussing, a very divided society along racial lines. Despite issues of minority versus majority, there's a shared history of dehumanization and indignity suffered by Black people. Are there lessons that a 26-year-old democracy can learn from one that is 244 years old?
Oh yes, I think the matter is that we should never assume that the matter of the eradication of racism in our societies is a matter that's very simple, that can be done in limited short periods of time. I think the persistence of racism in the US after the abolition of slavery, after the Civil War, and in all of that, the Emancipation Declaration, the human rights struggle, Martin Luther King Jr., and all of those struggles, civil rights legislation, and so on, voting, and all of those interventions, that despite all of that, you still have racism manifesting itself in the way that it does, I think communicates a message that even for us here in South Africa, we need to have a very close look at this matter when our constitution says we must produce a non-racial South Africa. Now, how do we respond to that challenge? It's a constitutional challenge. It's part of the National Compact. When we all agreed on the constitution, we said, yes, we agree, there must be this non-racial South Africa. But I'm saying the example of the US, it says to us, this racism is very stubborn. That to uproot it so that you do indeed have a non-racial South Africa, a non-racial society, is going to require a lot of deep thinking and really something meaningful done to change society so that it produces that result.
And it has to be a national project, Mr. President. I think that's the lesson.
It has to be a national project. There has to be a national project. All of us, there should be no South African, as there should be no American. We should not say racism is a national challenge to all of us, whether we're black or white, and therefore let's get to join hands to fight it. That's part of the challenge of building that national front to address what in fact is a national problem.
Let's shift focus now, Mr. President. There are a number of topics I want to get to, including the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to touch on that now and how it underscored, much like here in the United States, and to quote President Ramaphosa, calling it called the lasting disparities between South Africa's rich and poor, a distinction more often than not that is determined by the color of one's skin. Black people in the United States have been disproportionately affected in terms of death and infections in the United States. If this, as many people are saying, sir, is an inflection point, how do we ensure that this inflection point is not lost on all of us?
Well, I would imagine that the part of the impact of this COVID-19 has been to convince anybody who needed convincing that there are indeed these sharp divides. As you say, the manifestation of the impact of COVID-19 in the US its disproportionate impact on the African American population. It's a reflection of the socio-economic condition of the people. You see all of this discussion about compromised immune systems.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what compromises immune system is your quality of life. If you suffer from food deficiency, all sorts of other deficiencies, your immune system gets compromised. And therefore, this COVID virus, the coronavirus, will naturally impact on those people with those weakened.
The lack of access to healthcare, for example, right? And being underinsured. It's a big conversation in South Africa right now.
Sure. So the poor health is related to the poor socioeconomic condition. And so I'm saying that if anybody needed educating about this, it's perfectly obvious that those who are denied this quality of life which guarantees health will be the first victims of this virus. And all it's done is just shown the disproportionate manner in which income, wealth, opportunity, and so on are distributed in our societies.
COVID-19 and its very big magnifying glass, Mr. President.
Absolutely.
So this virus has proven to be a real test for multilateralism, for appreciating science and data, for collaboration and cooperation. And yet the world, Mr. President, feels more divided than it's ever felt in a very long time, particularly because of the struggles you're seeing between the big powers, Russia, China, and of course the United States. Do you see a path to bridging these divides? And if so, how so?
Well, I think that we, contrary to what President Trump has said and done, I think the world actually needs desperately the World Health Organization. I'm talking specifically about a global response to the pandemic. All of us need this unifying body to bring together all of the possibilities, whatever is required globally. For instance, you know that the WHO some weeks back launched what is called the accelerator. That process, which was visualizing that the development of vaccines, the treatment, the diagnosis, all of that, that there should be no, as was said with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals, no country should be left behind. And therefore, whoever develops a vaccine first, that vaccine, as the Chinese have now said, China has said when they develop such a vaccine, it must be treated as public property, not as a matter that you sell to people depending on how much money they have. Let the vaccine be public property.
The people's vaccine, right?
The WHO is central to a process which would ensure that an outcome of that kind.
Do you support this people's vaccine, a free vaccine for everybody?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we need everybody vaccinated. We need everybody to be free of the virus. Because so long as somebody somewhere in the world has got the virus, it means that the whole world is threatened by recurrence of this virus. Therefore, everybody needs to be free of the virus. And therefore, once a vaccine gets developed, surely it must be available throughout the world.
The Secretary General of the United Nations has said that the world is as strong as its weakest health system. So I think it speaks to the point you're making now.
Absolutely correct.
Mr. President, let's just transition to two further issues before I let you go. The first is the acquittal of former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo by the ICC on crimes against humanity allegedly committed in 2010-2011 in the context of the disputed presidential election in that country at the time. While the prosecutorial team appeal continues in The Hague, the former president is free to return home. Are you concerned about what this could mean for the future of Cote d'Ivoire?
Well, I think it's a moment, it should be a moment of hope for the Cote d'Ivoire. Because for many years, my own communication with President Ouattara, I've been saying to him that it's absolutely imperative that Cote d'Ivoire must go through a process of national reconciliation. And that if it doesn't, the threat is that the civil war will resume. In principle, President Ouattara and myself have agreed on this. The fact that now, and clearly President Gbagbo was always a very important player in terms of that process of national reconciliation. Now that he is out of The Hague and can return to Cote d'Ivoire, I think it's a very, very good opportunity at last to address this matter of national reconciliation, national unity. And President Gbagbo, I've spoken to him before about this, very committed to contribute whatever he can to that particular outcome. And really, it's my hope that the Ivorians will then treat this return of President Gbagbo, and indeed his colleague Blé Goudé would treat the return of those two as a moment when genuinely, seriously, a process of national reconciliation will start.
Allow me just very briefly to remind you what Vijay Nambia wrote in response to you in Foreign Policy in 2011. Quote, "The post-election violence was a direct result of Mr. Gbagbo's refusal to accept defeat and his repeated rejection of all efforts to find a peaceful solution. Security forces loyal to him used heavy weapons against civilians in communities perceived as strongholds of President Ouattara." So the UN, very, very strong in their view that Gbagbo was the cause of the problem. That's something you and the UN disagreed on. Is that still a position you hold, Mr. President?
Yes, sure. I mean, the UN was wrong. I mean, you even have peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, who participated in the violence which resulted in the capture of President Gbagbo. Now, how do you have peacekeepers siding with one faction in the country like that? It was wrong. For instance, I mean, what President Gbagbo had said was that, you know, here we have this dispute in Cote d'Ivoire about who has won. To solve this problem, why don't we get the international commission, the international community, the UN? He mentioned the UN, he mentioned the European Union, he mentioned the African Union. Let these ones come together and look at this matter, and we, the contestants, must make a commitment that we will be bound by the outcome of that international inquiry, and let these people come and have a look at this thing, make a decision, and let us respect that decision. Very, very rational, very reasonable, because you see, part of what happened is that the Constitutional Council in Cote d'Ivoire said President Gbagbo had won. And that is the only legal body in terms of the Constitution of Cote d'Ivoire which has got the power to decide who has won. Then you have the Electoral Commission, which is supposed to report to the Constitutional Council. It then proclaims that President Ouattara has won. It had no such legal mandate. Then the representative of the Secretary General then does another wrong thing. He was the resolution of the Security Council giving him a mandate to assist with regard to those elections, was to support the national institutions. But it doesn't.
Can I just jump in? This is what Vijay Nambia wrote at the time. The legal basis for the UN certification mandate is derived from the Pretoria Agreement and subsequent declaration on the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement. Are you differing with that view? No.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The electoral mandate given to the SRSG was to support the institutions of Cote d'Ivoire which manage elections. I discussed this thing with the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan. Because what the Ivorians wanted...
It was Ban Ki-moon at the time.
No. At the time that the decision was taken of giving the electoral mandate to the SRSG, it was Kofi Annan. What the Ivorians had wanted was that the UN should run the elections in Cote d'Ivoire. And Kofi said, no, that can only happen in instances where you have a failed state, which is why the UN ran the elections in East Timor. But in the Ivorian case, you don't have a failed state. You have got a government, and therefore, the UN representative will support the legitimate and legal institutions responsible. And that was the mandate of the SRSG. He went beyond that mandate and became somebody who now determines who has won, contrary to what the legal authorities in Cote d'Ivoire said. So no, we disagree with the UN about this thing, and we continue to disagree.
But reconciliation now needs to be the focus, is your point?
That should be the focus. That should be focus, and I think it's very necessary and very possible.
Mr. President, a final question for you. Swedish prosecutors today closed a 34-year-old case into the assassination of your friend, former Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, fingering a likely lone assassin who died some years back. Palme was, of course, a fierce critic of the apartheid regime, and speculation swirled for many years that they might have had a hand in his assassination. What do you say, and what do you make of these developments today?
You know, for the, I don't know what the Swedish authorities finally are saying about this, whether they've now closed the matter. But certainly from our point of view, we've always had the very deep suspicion that the apartheid regime would have been involved in the assassination of Olof Palme because of the positions it took against apartheid, in support of the struggle, in support of the ANC, in support of the UDF and all that. And immediately, you know, there had been a rally, what was called a People's Parliament in Stockholm, which brought together all the Swedish people. You also had international support. Oliver Tambo came to speak there. Olof Palme spoke there. A very powerful demonstration of the unity of Sweden, and indeed the unity of the world against apartheid. Olof Palme spoke there. That was the last public speech. The following week, a week later, he was assassinated. So it seemed to us very clear that even that speech at the People's Parliament would have said to the regime here, it's time that this man goes. Well, the matter has been under investigation for many years. When we became government here in South Africa, we also did what we could to investigate this. The matter was raised also at the TRC, and we couldn't find any facts to substantiate our suspicion. But I would rely on what the Swedish investigative authorities say on this matter, because indeed over these years, 35 years now, they've been investigating this matter, and I think that the ones would be best placed to determine this matter. But I think it would be important, that would be my view, it would be important that the Swedish authorities, the investigative authorities, should really give a public account of what they have found, why they think that this was the person who killed, and all of that. Because I don't think it would be correct for them to leave the Swedish people in the first instance, but also the rest of us still puzzling what exactly happened. I think if they have an answer to that question, it would be important that to close the issue, that the Swedish authorities should indeed give that public answer.
So let me give you a final word, Mr. President, as we try to have a full circle moment in this interview. Given the discussion we started off with about race and racism around the world, you once wrote about Olof and Lisbeth Palme that they represented a healthy human condition and that he sought to construct a healthy human condition. He really did represent the best of humanity, did he not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing what the Swedes did. Even the fact that this is a Western country, and they took a position, the government, that apartheid was impermissible. The crime against humanity, we've got to act against it. But what was more remarkable was the point that Olof Palme would make, was that we support the ANC because we too are against apartheid. And we give them whatever support we give. But that does not give us a right to tell the ANC what to think and what to do. So the ANC will decide for itself what to do for its people. We will work with them to end apartheid. It's the same position they took with regard to Vietnam. Whereas people were saying, no, how can you support this communist Viet Cong and so on? Olof Palme said, the critical issue here is the right to self-determination. The Vietnamese people are fighting for the right to self-determination, and we must support them. And we cannot say, therefore, because we support you, we dictate that you must think like this or do like, because you take away that right to self-determination. So I'm saying it was a remarkable position, Western country, to take positions like that and provide that leadership entirely to the Western country was very, very important. You know, Olof Palme, Lisbeth, his wife, the Swedish people generally, I think will, for us as South Africans, will always remain these very close friends who are very central to the process of the destruction of the apartheid system. Incident.
All right, that exclusive interview there, Sherwin, Bryce-Pease, SABC news correspondent in the United States, conducting with South Africa's former President Thabo Mbeki. The last part of that interview, much focus, of course, on the 34-year-old case, the assassination of his friend and the former Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. Of course, you'd know earlier on today that the Swedish authorities, they're absolving the apartheid government in that assassination, but Mr. Mbeki basically saying that they've always had the suspicion that the apartheid government had a hand in his assassination because of his views and his support of the ANC during the apartheid era. So he says, though, then that they would then rely now on what the Swedish authorities say on that matter. Also widespread, speaking about the national challenge, he calls it, relating to racism, of course, following what happened in the United States of America with the killing of George Floyd, saying that this serves as an example to South Africa, and it reveals the socio-economic divides both in the United States and in South Africa. South Africa also grappling with issues of racism so many years into democracy. Also the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus, him also touching on that, and how it has had an impact on Black Americans in that particular country. Saying also, of course, I see support coming for the WHO as well, saying that a global response to the pandemic is needed. We need that unifying body. The former president of South Africa says in speaking about the WHO, and importantly on a vaccine, saying that as the search continues for a vaccine for the coronavirus, no country should be left behind, and when that vaccine is developed, it should be available to all and not just those who have money. We'll play segments of that interview once again on African Perspective with host Aldrin St-Pierre, and we'll of course repeat it here on the SABC News channel. So you haven't missed anything. We'll continue to play it here on the SABC News channel. The former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, speaking on an array of issues that are affecting the United States, South Africa, speaking about the coronavirus, and of course the return of the former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo to his country, him saying that that should be a moment of hope. So you'd certainly catch that interview here on the SABC News channel. We'll repeat it, but shortly after 9 o'clock with Aldrin St-Pierre, there'll be snippets